How's it going, everybody? It's once again time for Tea with Andrew here. Today, we're going to be talking about a little bit about some buyers' issues, some things, and more than anything, I'm going to be stressing the importance of the temporary residential leases and why you should try to avoid them at all costs. I mean, I understand the need of them. There's a reason, but there's so many things that we need to understand deeply about these leases and how they work. It is just a really scary spot to put yourself and your clients in. So we're going to go through those. One thing I'm seeing more and more, and I just want to talk about real quick, is more and more deals halfway through a transaction we're finding out is in a contingency where there's no contingency backup. So make sure if you're working with a buyer, have that conversation with them. Make sure they don't have to sell their home first. Talk to the lender. Make sure they don't have to sell the home first. And same is true as if you're representing a seller. Have that conversation with the lender and say, hey, is there anything that I need to know about before I take this deal? Do they have a contingency? And I don't think it's always agents doing something underhanded. I think sometimes that the buyer doesn't understand that they need to disclose that, or the buyer is not informing the seller that it's the buyer's agent that it's a requirement. So I just want to throw that out there because I've seen just multiple deals, and I'm not going to lie, I was the buyer's agent on one of them recently where this happened, where I had talked to my buyers months before. I knew they had a contract on a sale. I assumed it had sold months before we went under a contract and never talked about it again. They never talked about it again. And then day of closing comes along and they're like, well, we haven't closed on our other house yet. Like, oh, no. So it happens. Be vigilant, know what's going on. And have those conversations early, because you don't want to be in a situation where you've paid for an inspection, you paid for an appraisal, you've done all these things, and the deal bombs because you're not able to close. So just have that conversation on both sides of the table, what's going on. Another thing, I was talking with an agent today, and another issue that's happening, if a buyer calls you and you represent the seller, be very careful. You can't help them too much. You can answer simple questions, but you can't do anything that would create an agency issue. You do need to tell them, listen, I can't help you. If their answer is, hey, my agent's not answering my calls, like, contact a broker, do what you need to do, but be very careful about going into too much detail with them. We don't want to be in a situation where it looks like we're trying to do both sides of a transaction. So it's a very narrow. So you don't want to be the jerk who refuses to talk to them, but you also don't want to be the person who put yourself in a situation where you can get in trouble. Now we're going to talk about temporary residential leases. Temporary residential leases are definitely a necessity at times, but should always be treated as a last ditch effort scenario. We've got to understand, according to possession in the contract, possession occurs one of two ways. Upon closing and funding being the nominal word there, or according to the terms of a temporary residential lease. And why that's important is possession occurs upon a temporary residential lease. And we're going to go through both a buyer's temporary residential lease and a seller's temporary residential lease to make sure you understand the pitfalls and things that you're putting your client into and issues that can occur. Parties of the transaction of the lease, the landlord, in a buyer's temporary situation, the seller is the landlord and the buyer is the tenant. Landlord lease is the tenant described in the contract between landlord and seller and tenant, known as, putting the address there. It will commence on blank and terminates as specified in paragraph 18. Paragraph 18 is upon closing. Rental will be blank dollars per day. Now, the way a temporary residential lease works, and you'll see this, tenant shall pay the landlord the full amount of rental. So if we're going to lease this property for 15, 20 days, whatever it is, we've got to take that amount of money times the number of days, and that amount of money we have to give to the landlord or the seller upon the temporary residential lease. So you need to move in there and have that money there. Now, if it goes on a couple more days, you're going to have to make up the difference at closing, and that is the point of that. Now, earnest money is not deposit, so you need to understand that. A separate deposit, tenant has paid to landlord blank dollars as deposit to secure the performance of this lease by tenant. If the lease is terminated before closing date, landlord may use the deposit to satisfy tenant's obligations. Under this lease, shall refund to the tenant any unused portion of the deposit together with an itemized list of all deductions from the deposit within 30 days after tenant. So A, surrenders the possession of the property, or B, provides landlord written notice of tenant's forwarding address, and B. So you have to give them a forwarding address. So if you just move out and disappear, you can't be like, hey, you have 30 days to give me my money. If you haven't given them notice of where to give the money, they can't give the money to anybody. So that is something that is important. The clock of the 30 days does not start until you have both gotten possession of the property, and B, been given a written notice of the tenant's forwarding address, just like in a lease situation, a true lease situation. If this lease is terminated by the closing and funding of the sale of the property, the tenant deposit will be refunded to tenant at closing and funding. So you get your money back at closing if it is closed. Deposit must be in addition to earnest money under the contract. That is a notice. It is underlined. It makes sure it is all capitalized. Earnest money is not the deposit. It is a separate part of the contract. Now, the seller is responsible for keeping all utilities up and running through the time of the transaction until we get in a situation of temporary residential lease. And paragraph 6 says clearly, tenant shall pay all utility connections, deposits, and charges except blank, which landlord will pay. So unless you've written in here water, gas, electric, the seller is no longer responsible for the utilities upon the buyer moving in as a temporary residential lease. So that is an important thing to understand. It's not, hey, I'm renting here, I get free utilities for the next so many days because that's in the contract. The temporary residential lease will take effect, and you are now responsible for utilities from now on. Use of property. Tenant may use this property for only residential purposes. Tenant may not assign this lease or sublet it in any part. Tenant may not keep pets on property except. This is huge. If you have pets, we need to have that conversation prior to you moving in with a temporary residential lease. If it's a temporary residential lease and I go there and you've got 2 cats and 4 dogs, and they're not written on paragraph 8, we've got a problem. You've violated the temporary residential lease. Now, condition of property. Tenant accepts the property in its present condition and state of repair. But landlord shall make all repairs and improvements required by the contract. If this lease is terminated prior to closing, tenant shall surrender possession of the property to landlord in its present condition as improved by landlord, except normal wear and tear and any casualty loss. So, any agreed to repairs have to be done still to this point. Now, paragraph 10 is kind of terrifying and crazy and hard for a buyer to wrap their head around. So let's go through this real quick and make sure we understand it. Tenant may not make any holes or drive nails into woodwork, floors, walls, ceilings, alter, paint, or decorate the property, or install improvements or fixtures without prior written consent of landlord. Any improvements or fixtures placed on the property during the lease become part of the property. You cannot drive a nail into the drywall while you're in a temporary residential lease situation. You cannot hang an item. Now, temporary residential lease, you move in, you're unpacking, you're making the place your own. You're going to start doing stuff. And in doing stuff, you could very easily violate this temporary residential lease in paragraph 10. Hanging a picture on a wall. If there's not already a nail hole there, you have violated paragraph 10 of this temporary residential lease. So making sure you have that understanding with your buyers, like, listen, you own it, but you don't own it. And you're not even allowed to drive a nail in a wall. That's as serious as they're making this situation. Paragraph 11, again, treat it just like every paragraph 11. Don't ever write it in it. Inspections. Landlord may enter at reasonable times to inspect, replace, repair, or complete improvements. Tenant shall provide landlord door keys and access codes to allow access to the property during the term of the lease. So you're actually saying you don't get to change the locks, or if you do change the locks, you have to give the landlord or the seller a key while you're in this situation. Tenant shall comply with all applicable laws, restrictions, ordinance, rules, and regulations with respect to the property. Now, we've talked about this in the past. It's very much true. Repairs and maintenance. Anytime the Texas Real Estate Commission or Texas Realtors want you to truly understand something, they're either going to bold it or underline it. In this case, paragraph 14 is underlined. Except as otherwise provided in this lease, tenant shall bear all expenses of repairing, replacing, and maintaining the property, including but not limited to yard, trees, shrubs, and all equipment and appliances, unless otherwise required by the Texas Property Code. Tenant shall promptly repair at tenant's expense any damage to the property caused directly or indirectly by any act or omission of the tenant or any person other than the landlord, agents, or invitees. Scary thing is, you have taken possession of this property, which means everything's working. You move in, the water heater breaks. It's your house. You are now responsible for repairing and replacing the water heater. It's no longer the owner's responsibility, the seller's responsibility, because you've taken possession. You now shall bear all expense of repairing, replacing, and maintaining the property. So that is another one that's kind of scary. You can't put anything on the walls, but if anything breaks, you have to pay to fix it. So this is one of those reasons why buyers, temporary residential leases, just a scary, scary thought and a thing, because a lot of times people come in, hey, this is broken. And the other agent, if they read this understand it, say, hey, that sucks. It's your client's responsibility, not ours. And that's where, fights and arguments can come into play. Indemnity, tenant indemnifies landlord from claims of all third parties for injury or damage to personal property. Insurance, landlord and tenant shall each maintain such insurance on the contracts and property as each party may deem appropriate during the term of this lease. Note, consult your insurance agent. Possession of the property by buyer as tenant may change insurance policy coverage. If you're a seller and you're selling the property to a buyer and they move into a residential lease, you need to make sure you notify your insurance company that there is someone leasing the property, because that could really affect what coverage you're accepted or not. Same is true with buyers. If you've moved in and you don't have have not paid for your insurance yet, you're basically a renter. And if you don't have renter's insurance and the house burns down, your belongings may not be covered. So you've got to make sure you talk to your insurance companies about what are the needs of your clients in those situations. So it's just a huge thing to talk about. If the tragedy happens, and it's happened before, house burns down prior to closing, temporary residential lease, I've seen the sellers not get covered because they were covered for tenants, and I've seen the buyers not be covered because their belongings weren't covered. So it's just crazy situations that can happen. Make sure you're advising your clients, talk to the insurance companies about what can and can't be done. Default. Paragraph 17, if tenant fails to perform or observe any provision of this lease and fails within 24 hours after notice by landlord to commence and diligently pursue to remedy such failure, tenant will be in default. This lease terminates upon either A, closing and funding of the seller under the contract, B, termination of the contract prior to closing, or tenant's default under this lease, or tenant's default under the contract, whichever occurs first. Upon termination, other than by closing and funding of the sale, tenant shall surrender possession of the property. Holding over. Any possession by tenant after termination creates a tenancy at sufferance and will not operate to renew or extend this lease. Tenant shall pay blank per day during the period of any possession after termination is damages, in addition to any other remedies to which landlord is entitled. Now, if you don't put anything on paragraph 19, again, I'm not an attorney, I can't give legal advice, but you're not offering additional money per day. And that's kind of the scary thing. You want to put a number in there. Normally, you're going to want to put it for more than what the rent that is agreed upon in the first page is. But that is a question between you and your broker about how you're going to do it and how you're going to handle it. And at the end of the day, is a negotiation agreed upon between the buyer and the seller. But in this situation, I'm going to want more because it's a holdover situation we need to get taken care of. Attorney's fees. The prevailing party in all legal proceedings brought under or with respect to this lease is entitled to recover from the non-prevailing party all costs. Smoke alarms. Texas Property Code requires landlord to install smoke alarms in certain locations with the property landlord's expense. Tenant expressly waives landlord's duty to inspect and repair smoke alarms. So if it's a sale situation and it turns into a temporary residential lease, you now have to make sure you're following the tenant laws as far as security, as smoke alarms go into effect. Those include making sure they're in every bedroom as well as on every floor in hallways. Security devices. The requirements of the Texas Property Code relating to security devices do not apply to residential lease for a term of 90 days or less. So what this is saying, another requirement for property management is you have to change locks. Since a temporary residential lease is under 90 days, it does not fall under the Texas Property Code requiring security devices to be changed. The seller is not required to change the locks for the buyer. Consult your attorney. Make sure in all situations you're advising your clients to talk to an attorney, and that you're informing them that you cannot give legal advice. Notices. All loan notices will be given to the landlord or the seller at their information and the tenant at their information. And be careful, guys. Don't be the middleman too much on this. You are not a leasing agent. It's not your job to be a property manager for 90 days. This is a deal between them. Do what you can to keep it between them. It's difficult to do, but definitely something that needs to be discussed and said, hey guys, this is what it is. I'm not a property manager. I don't want to be. So that's the buyer side. The seller side is very similar, so it's going to go through a little bit quicker. Well, a lot of the similar things need to be talked about because there's some trip ups at what can happen. Seller's temporary residential lease. Parties of leases are blank is the landlord. In this situation, the landlord is the buyer, and blank is the tenant. Is the seller is the tenant. Lease. Landlord leases the tenant to tenant. Landlord leases to tenant the property described in the contract as blank. Put in the address. Terms of this lease commence on the date of the sale covered by the contract and is closed and funded and terminates blank unless terminated earlier by reason of other provisions. So that's going to put. It starts on the date of closing and continues on for an additional number of days. Rental. Tenant shall pay to landlord as rental blank per day, excluding the day of closing and funding, with the full amount of rental for the term of the lease to be paid at time of funding. Tenant will not be entitled to any refund or rental of this lease termination, early due to tenant's default or voluntary surrender of the property. So what's one of those things? So I say, listen, I only need 20 days to move out. Just to make math simple for me, we say it's $100 a day. 20 days, it's $2,000. So I'm going to write you a check for $2,000. I move out in 4 days. I don't get those 16 days worth of money back. So just make sure your seller can understand that as well. If they said for 20 days and they don't use 20 days, they don't get a refund. Deposit. Deposit is very important here, and we're going to talk about this. Tenant shall pay the landlord at the time of funding of the sale. Blank as a deposit to secure performance of this lease by tenant. Landlord may use deposit to satisfy tenant's obligations under the lease, and landlord shall refund any unused portion. So this is very similar to the buyer's side deposit, but let's talk about the difference between these two real quick. My only ability to make sure that the seller leaves that property in good shape is I'm not going to buy it until I'm satisfied with the property. Well, now I've bought it, they're still in it. I need to make sure I have a hefty enough deposit that they're not going to steal the light bulbs, steal light fixtures, change out sinks, change out appliances, any of those things that can happen. So you've got to be thinking about that as a buyer. What kind of deposit do I need to leave to make sure no shenanigans happen? Sorry about that. No shenanigans happen when I'm trying to get stuff done. Utilities. Tenant shall pay all utility charges except blank, which landlord shall pay. So again, in this situation, the seller will just keep utilities running and be responsible for them. Use of property. Tenant may use the property only for residential purposes. Tenant may not assign a lease or sublet any part of the property. Pets. Tenant may not keep pets on the property except. Now it's a little easier here. We know what pets you have because you're the seller and you're already in the property. We should know if there's a dog or a cat in the house. You can't be getting anything more and additional. Tenant accepts the property in its present condition, state of repair at commencement of the lease. Tenant shall surrender the property to the landlord in condition required under the contract. Alterations. Tenant may not alter the property and install improvements or fixtures without prior written consent of the landlord. Any improvements or fixtures placed on during the lease become property of the landlord. So if you make any changes or do anything, alterations, one, you need written permission, but two, they belong to the buyer. Again, do not write in paragraph 11. It just makes life a whole lot easier. Landlord may enter at reasonable times to inspect the property. Tenant shall provide landlord door keys and access codes to allow access to the property during the term of the lease. So now in this situation, the seller is responsible for giving the buyer a copy of the lease. Laws. Tenant shall comply with all applicable laws, restrictions, ordinances, rules, and regulations with respect and property. Again, paragraph 14, we're going to be talking about repairs and maintenance. Except as otherwise provided by this lease, tenant shall bear all expense of repairing and maintaining the property, including but not limited to the yard, trees, and shrubs, unless otherwise required by the Texas Property Code. Tenant shall promptly repair at tenant's expense any damage to the property caused directly or indirectly by any act or omission. So the seller is still responsible for any repairs at this time. So making sure I understand that is important. Indemnity. Tenant indemnifies landlord from claims of both third parties. Insurance, just the same way. You've got to make sure how you're insured. Have your clients talk to their insurance company. Default works the same way. Termination works the same way. Holding over, again, make sure you have a number in there where if it's going to be more days, you need to know, because the buyers would want to move into their house. The sellers aren't ready to move out. What do we got to do? We want to make sure that number is big enough to get them out of the property. So if you're doing $100 a day, again, talk to your brokers, talk to your clients about what they feel comfortable with saying. We want to make sure it goes up because it's got to be something where I don't want you to stay in the house. I want to move in. We want you to move out. Attorney's fees, prevailing party wins. Smoke alarms. Texas Property Code requires landlords to install smoke alarms at certain locations of the property at the landlord's expense. So understand this: if you're the buyer and the tenant is going to stay longer, the buyer is responsible for going and installing smoke alarms to make sure the seller has the smoke alarms that are required. So that's kind of crazy, but that is a requirement that's in there. Again, security devices are not required to be changed because it's under the 90-day period. Consult your attorney. Again, guys, very important to consult your attorney and understand that. Notices, all notices from one party to the other must be in writing and effective when mailed to, hand-delivered, or transmitted by facsimile or electronic transmission. Guys, at the end of the day, the biggest problem I have with temporary residential leases, more than anything else, is when you move into a property, you start to see the little things that you don't notice when you're walking through property. So if they're moving into it, they're going to see things, they're going to notice things. This doesn't do what I wanted it to, and it's going to create some issues and some frustration. So it's just one of those things. If you can avoid it, do everything you can to avoid it. Brian, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I have a couple things on it. One, yes, absolutely. If you can avoid a temp lease, but two, guys, I recently came across a violation that was filed with the Texas Real Estate Licensing Commission, and basically what they came through is they stated they actually issued a fine and a suspension of license. Let me build out the scenario. Andrew is the client or is the agent, right? And I'm the client. Andrew tells me, listen, I'm busy at 5 o'clock. We should fund by 5 o'clock. I'm going to hand you the key. Do not go to the house. Okay. I say, absolutely, Andrew. I'm not going to go to the house. Why would I go to the house? It's not my house yet. Right. Respectively, within an hour, this happens at, like, say, noon. I think it actually, so the beautiful thing about Texas Real Estate Commission is that they actually transcribe these hearings, which allows you to get a very interesting take on the whole situation. So he hands me the key, tells me not to go, right? Andrew goes on to his other 2 appointments that he has, and I proceed to the house. I open the door, I go in. The house funds at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But by that time, the agent and the seller are so mad, we're talking a 3-hour span here, so mad that they file a complaint against Andrew. Andrew ends up getting his license suspended, a $1,500 fine, and a derogatory mark across his license. And all he did was what a lot of people do, like, hey, listen, don't do this. But here's the thing. That is why it is so dangerous. If you give the opportunity for somebody to make a mistake, they're going to make the mistake. So a temp lease, while it is a detriment in that circumstance, let's do a temp lease. Now, one thing that I think oftentimes doesn't get mentioned, and this doesn't get mentioned in option money or in temp leases, it has to be for nominal consideration. Nominal consideration means what, right? So I asked Texas Legal Hotline on this one, what is nominal consideration? So in the option period, they expect that nominal consideration is at least $3, okay? But what is nominal consideration in a temp lease? That would be a debate of a court, but I would suggest that it probably needs to be reasonable to the mortgage amount that is being paid out. So if you're going to hand keys over, make sure that you have a temp lease in play. Like, don't hand keys until that temp lease is in play. And do not give out, and I know this happens all the time, but with the advent of camera technology, guys, 5 years ago, I had 0 cameras at my house. Today, I have like 7 cameras at my house, right? And that's not including any other, that's just stuff that I've installed over time. And yeah, it takes down your security, or not your security, but your insurance premium. So of course I'm going to install it. Cost me $100 to install, and it takes down my insurance by $300 a year. That makes perfect sense. But what it now allows for is that people know what's going on at the property, right? So, oh, I'm not at the property, really, because I see you, right? It's like, it's not the same, right? So this is something that is very prevalent, and it is something that a lot of people are doing. They're giving out one-day codes to their client. Worst thing you could possibly do.
I've got no issue with the one-day code as long as you give the one-day code after funding. And that's, I think, the key is. And I also want to clarify something real quick. That was an example. I did not do that. I was not fined. So let's make sure that that's very clear.
Yes, absolutely.
It was an example.
This was an agent out of San Antonio that actually lost their license as of right now because they made. And honestly, you have to ask yourself over the years. I mean, people make this. They've done this, right?
And it's usually the people that you've created a huge connection with, that you're boys, you're really good friends. Hey, I'm going to do this for you. Don't screw
family
me.
Members.
And it's always the ones that you say, don't screw me, that are going to screw you. It's very easy to do. And it's guys, in the world we're in, we've said this on multiple videos, multiple conversations. Always assume if you're at someone's house, you're being videotaped. Always assume that you're being recorded. Always assume that someone's listening to you, because more than likely they are, and it'll make your life a whole lot easier. If you can, if there's timestamp that you've been in that property. I've had multiple times where, as a listing agent, a buyer's agent, hey, can you give me a temporary residence, a one-day code? Absolutely, I'll give you one-day code. As soon as it's funded, I will give you one-day code, not before. And with that is, I'm not giving access to someone else's property before either, and that's going to put you in that situation. If you don't want the great thing of going and handing someone their keys, which if you're a buyer's agent, if you're not handing them their keys and excited to put them in there, it's a great opportunity to have that one last hurrah and a great time to say, hey, you're going to be receiving a review from me. I'd love it if you take some time to do a review while they're happy, and they're like, hey, yeah, sure, I'd love to do that. It's a great opportunity. If you can't do it, if there's something happens, we all know stuff happens. So I understand that 100%. Guys, in this time frame, you can't play anymore. You got to follow the rules.
Yeah, and the big thing is that it was the conversation about the 1-day code is on your obligation. So you as a agent, whoever gives that 1-day code. So if I give a 1-day code as an agent to Andrew as an agent, if he hands that to his client, he's now taking the responsibility because I've given it to him as a licensed agent. And that's what the central lock rules state. So liability falls to the party that has it if they are in a licensed capacity. So this is something that needs to be understood. But the reason I bring up the 1-day code and passing out keys, guys, this is the only place that I feel like temp leases are ever really necessary. When we have docs, we have everything in play, and it's the absolute bare bones only way to finish out the deal nice and smooth, right? Otherwise, just wait till funding. It's just the safety net. It's the protection. It has so many. Think about it. How can you honestly do a walkthrough of a property if it's not an empty property yet? It's not realistic.
A poster and a couch can hide a whole lot of problems.
They can, and even a picture, right? What is that hole? Oh, it was there before he bought it. Yeah, but it was behind a picture. Right? These things are oftentimes something that can cause a lot of havoc. So temp leases, I do my best to stay far, far away from them. But if absolutely necessary, the docs are at title. They're just waiting for the funding authorization to come through. If needed, maybe a temp lease for a day just to get them keys so they can start moving. Or if we get a Friday closing and a Monday funding, that's a valid place that maybe a temp lease could be in play. Or if the seller needs extra time after they've received funds, that's a dangerous one, but that's the only real other place that somewhat has a real relevance to put this in play.
So many times I have the conversation with sellers where like, yeah, I'll move out as soon as we close. No, you have to move out before we close. Well, I need the money to move out. We have to figure it out because, it's especially in situations where I'm buying a house and selling a house. I need to close on this one so then I can close on the other one so then I can move out and have the money to move out or a place to move my belongings. It can get real tricky real fast, but those are the issues, and that's something you got to lock down early. Day of closing, we can't have the buyer realizing they're not ready to move out of this house. You don't want to go in a situation of frustration to get a temporary residential lease signed. This is why you need to have a good reputation in this business. And this is why you need to have a good rapport with the other agents in this business. Because if you're a jerk or you've got a bad reputation, no other agent is going to sign a temporary residential lease with you because you're putting their clients in a precarious spot.
And can I just reiterate one last thing? One, agents, stop asking other agents to give keys. It's not safe. For you, for them, for anybody. Don't ask that question. If you're going to ask that question, follow it with a temp lease that justifies it. Because if you're asking for keys for before funding, you are putting yourself out there. Because remember, until it funds, it's not their property, which means if there's an insurance issue, if there's a damage to the property, guys, listen, Andrew and I have been in the business long enough to find these quirks where in the midst of funding, for instance, we were both there during 2006 when we had flooding rain. Well, guess what? We had a property that our uncle was selling, and guess what it did? It flooded whilst we were in the process of selling it. That property is no longer even there. It's now demolished.
It was the day it sold, and it actually funded and then was under 9 feet of water.
Yeah, come on. This is the things that can happen. And if you're in real estate long enough and you do enough transactions, you're going to have those things that teach you that you should have just done it the right way the whole time, all the time, every time. No matter if it's family, no matter if it's your best friend, Just do it the right way, and you're going to be protected in the long run. And honestly, those people that you go out and above, that you go and get the keys early, they're going to probably hold you to a higher standard and not give a good review and all those other things, because they're usually very high maintenance. So just stop asking for keys. I guess that's a way for me to say, hey guys, don't send me a message, because I'm going to tell you the same thing I say every time. Either it funds or I have a temp lease in hand.
And
That has nominal consideration.
I'm seeing it a lot. I don't know if you are as well in the showing timeframes too, where people are saying, there is no bigger red flag to a listing agent than, hey, can I have a 1-day code? No, I'm not giving you a 1-day code, because we both know that means you're not going to the house, and I'm not giving you a 1-day code. It's one of those things where it's like, hey, I will flat out here, hey, I'm on the west side, the house on the east side. I don't want to drive out there. Can you just give me a 1-day code for the client? No way in hell am I going to do that. I'm not putting myself in that situation. And I'm not, guys, remember, at the end of the day, this is someone's belongings, and there's a house. And if they find out you're doing this, they're going to be livid and they're going to be frustrated. Guys, we make a really good paycheck showing and selling homes. Earn it.
Why would you put your license at risk? Remember, I just told you, this guy fully anticipated. We're talking 3 hours before funding, and the guy has no license. That means he cannot receive compensation in form of commission on a sale. He just lost his livelihood because of 3 hours and him trusting a client to do something that he knew could be wrong. So you're talking losing your license, losing your income for something that all it had to do is, 1, wait 3 hours, or 2, come up with an alternative solution, such as a temp lease in the midst.
No,
Don't
absolutely.
do that.
So just something to think about, guys. It's too easy to do and too easy to get in trouble for. And that's the thing is sometimes we just have to have the conversation and understand that. And understand if they do a temporary residential lease, what the drawbacks are, what the fears are. Buyer moves in before closing, something happens and the house burns down. They're a tenant, which means if they don't have renter's insurance, their belongings are not insured. That's huge conversations that you have to have with your clients, even if you do one of these forms. So just think about it, read it, go through it. Nobody reads a temporary residential lease until there's an issue with the temporary residential lease. And that is not the right time to be looking at it.
See you guys.
All right, guys, appreciate it. That's all we got today. Have a good one.
See ya.